I'm sure that you've all heard about the hurricane hitting western North Carolina back in the fall. It's an understatement to say that it's been an intense experience. When the storm whipped through the area, it toppled thousands of trees, dropped an unfathomable amount of rain, resulting in landslides, flooded valleys, and raging rivers. In some of our rivers, it was the largest flood ever recorded in history. And there was so much destruction, so much human loss. Over 100 people in North Carolina tragically lost their lives. Many more lost their homes, their businesses, their belongings. Many people are still struggling today. For me, as a conservation biologist, I saw things through an additional lens. I experienced another layer of loss due to the ecological destruction. This storm was a huge setback for many of the wildlife species that myself and others have been working very hard to conserve. But I want to take a step back for just a moment and tell you a little bit about my path to this point in time. I grew up just outside of Asheville, North Carolina, on a small family farm. And I spent a lot of time playing outside, in the creek, helping in our garden, taking care of our animals. And I loved to play soccer. And I was lucky enough to get into this awesome school called the North Carolina School of Science and Math. And this experience really broadened my perspective on the world. Some of my very best friends today are from my time here. And it led to new opportunities. After high school, I went on to go to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, followed by getting my master's degree in ecology at the University of Georgia. Along the way, I had some really great mentors that inspired me and they encouraged me. But it was also my own passion for the natural world and my belief that I could make a difference that helped lead me to where I am today. After grad school, I didn't know exactly what my kind of job I was going to get. But I did know that I felt a deep connection to the mountains, the rivers, and the forests of this area. And I hoped that I would be able to play a role in protecting the incredible biodiversity that we have. Now, as a conservation biologist and herpetologist with the state, I've been able to play an integral role in conservation in this area. One of the species that I've worked with the most is the bog turtle. It's North America's smallest turtle. They're only about 3 to 4 inches long as an adult and about the size of a quarter when they hatch out of their egg. They live an incredibly fascinating and mysterious life. They tunnel through the mud, hiding under the plants and basking, laying their eggs on these little raised hummocks of vegetation in these special wetlands called mountain bogs or southern Appalachian bogs. They're incredibly difficult to find. In fact, one of the ways that we search for them is by sticking our bare hands deep down into the mud and feeling around and hoping that we find one that we can pull out. It's a little bit ridiculous sounding, I know. I often tell people that my guess is that it's harder than searching for a needle in a haystack. They live in these mountain bogs that are spring-fed, which means the water bubbles up out of the ground, and that's what keeps them wet year-round, not streams flowing through them, not the rainfall. These bogs have deep, mucky soils, and they have areas that are dominated by low-growing vegetation that gets lots of sunlight at the ground level. A lot of times when people think of Western North Carolina, they think of mountain views, they think of waterfalls, and we have those, but we also have these mountain bogs. They're really special. They have an incredibly biodiverse plant and animal community. Plants like the carnivorous sundew, tons of different leafy ferns, sphagnum moss, pitcher plants, cranberries, and so many more. And then way too many wildlife species to be able to list out or to talk about right now. It's a really beautiful place to spend a day. So I want to talk to you now about two species that were affected directly by Hurricane Helene. The bog turtle, which I'll get back to in a moment, and a species I haven't mentioned yet, the hellbender. I see some faces wondering what that is. It's a giant salamander that lives in cold, clean, rushing mountain rivers. They can grow to be over 2 feet long, and they breathe oxygen through these special skin folds that run down the length of their entire body. They're pretty camouflaged, so if you're lucky enough to see one walking along the ground, it's pretty hard to see. They spend time hiding under big rock slabs and eating crayfish. One of the ways that we look for them is by snorkeling in these freezing cold rivers. My colleague Lori Williams and others have been working really hard on conservation of the species in North Carolina. In fact, North Carolina was considered the stronghold for the hellbender prior to the storm, because we had the very best remaining populations of the species. To our great dismay, many of those best populations were in the rivers that were hit the hardest by Hurricane Helene. And this is a sampling of what some of that looked like. Very extreme erosion, changed channels where the river even changed course, debris washed up and all over in the river. And in some sections of the river, the vegetation in the riparian area along the edge of the river is entirely gone, including all the trees. So this is really severe impacts. And then we also have had over 100 reports of people finding dead hellbenders washed up after the flood outside the river that were dead. And the story is not all that different for the bogs. Myself and others have been working very, very hard prior to the storm on conservation of this species. To our knowledge, we only had 1 to maybe up to 3 populations that we considered stable of the bog turtle in North Carolina. That means that all the other populations were declining in numbers over time, getting smaller and smaller and smaller, to the point where if we don't intervene, if something doesn't get turned around, they're going to be gone or extirpated at that location. And so, we've been doing all kinds of things prior to the storm to boost the populations, from protecting the bogs, restoring habitat, to addressing specific threats that affect the bog turtle, like putting cages over the nests, which are on the ground to keep predators out, and installing road crossing structures to help turtles get and other wildlife from one side of the road to the other between wetlands so they don't get run over on the road, and so much more. After the storm, we started going out to all of these bogs to try to assess the impacts from the storm. And there was good news at some of them. Some of them were relatively undisturbed. But others, we saw very severe impacts. That includes prolonged and deep flooding that occurred, as well as large sediment and rock deposits within these wetlands, sometimes feet thick, that filled up sections of the wetland. And then some very severe erosion and scouring, where sections of the wetland effectively rolled up and sometimes washed away downstream or downriver. So at this point, we've started to get an idea of the impacts to the habitat. But because the turtles are inactive in the winter, we won't know the full impacts on the actual turtles until we can start assessing this spring and in the coming years. So the one really bad piece of news is that of our best 5 populations that we have of bog turtles in North Carolina, the habitat at 4 of them was severely impacted by the storm, like what you see in these photos. And so, news like this can feel really heavy, not just for me, but for anyone to hear, and can leave us feeling really discouraged. To be honest, in the aftermath of the storm, I felt It felt kind of hopeless for a while. So I want to talk a little bit about that feeling. After the storm, I had a lot of personal challenges to deal with. I was lucky, I was fortunate, but we also had lost power and water for 15 days, no cell phone service. We had no internet for a month. My daughter was out of school for a month, and we had a ton of cleanup on our property, down trees on top of things. Our culvert on our driveway was washed out. We had a flooded crawl space. So I went through a lot. And then when I got back to working full-time again, I was faced with a whole new challenge, and that was that every day I was immersed in going out and seeing more places that had been devastated by the storm, and in hearing more and more tragic stories. And that was really hard. And I'll say as scientists we're taught, put your feelings and your emotions and your opinions, put them over here. And then keep that separate from your work and from the science. And that has generally worked pretty well for me. But in this experience, everything was coming at me at once, and it was really overwhelming, and I felt so much. And I've realized through this experience that I needed to let myself feel all of that. And I also needed to let myself grieve as a scientist what I had witnessed having happened to these places and these animals that I've been working so hard to conserve. And so, at this point, I had some questions like, what now? What do I do about my work? And to be honest, I felt really discouraged. But luckily, I did find hope. And so, all around me after the storm, there are all these stories coming out about people helping people, neighbors going to help their neighbors, and then of thousands of people and organizations coming into Western North Carolina to help us. And those stories were really heartwarming. I experienced some of that firsthand. We had, after when I finally could get messages again, I had so many people who had reached out offering to come help us in the field, to bring us supplies, and do all sorts of things like offer to write grants and find funding for us to help us with what they knew was coming. And all of that helped me feel like I was not so alone in all of this, and also that, to feel hopeful. Then I also noticed there was a resilience of nature. And I saw that there was beauty even amid the destruction of it all. And that helped me feel hope. I want to tell you a couple stories about that. One day, I got a text message from someone that knew someone that knew someone that knew someone that had found a hellbender that was alive, but it needed help. And so I went out to rescue this hellbender, not really knowing what I was getting into. And in one day, I saw so much. It's really beyond words. I saw where houses had once been and were gone, washed away in the flood. I saw where roads and bridges had collapsed and had disappeared downriver. And I met people that day who had lost their loved ones in the flood. And somehow, even in this incredibly difficult time, there was a real beauty in the way that the people out there had come together to help each other and to help this hellbender. This is an incredible story of the survival of a hellbender. Remember, this is the species that needs that cold, clean, rushing, oxygenated water. It was found after 5 weeks in stagnant mud in a basement. How did it get there? It's hard to imagine this if you've never seen, but the river was effectively flowing through houses. In this one house, the river filled up the basement basically with mud and deposited this hellbender. So when I got there, they had taken the time to save this hellbender and put it into this tub of water with cold flowing spring water. And so the first miracle is that the hellbender survived. But the second part of this incredible story is that these people who were still going through so much recognized that another member of their community needed help, this hellbender, and they also saved it. By the time I got there, this hellbender looked incredibly healthy. It was amazing. This was a really powerful experience for me. And then around the same time, we were going out to all these bogs and assessing the impacts to the bogs. And one day, as I was standing in this one bog that's on the edge of a large river that saw the largest flood ever recorded in history, I was standing there and I was struck by the beauty of how this floodplain wetland had done exactly its job. And it had absorbed and slowed the floodwaters as it was meant to do. And the incredible part was that other than 11 and 12 feet high up in the branches was where there was debris. Other than that, that's how high the water was. Other than that, you could barely tell there had been this incredible flood there. And there was a beauty in that. That was in sharp contrast to what it looked like on the same river in areas that were developed with pavement and roads and buildings that looked awful. So this was a really incredible thing for me to witness. And in the midst of all this, time was marching on, right? And the seasons changed. And we went out and we saw places that were relatively unscathed. And we saw that the fall colors were gorgeous. And this allowed me to appreciate the beauty that still remained in the mountains and also to hold on to that feeling of hope. And with that newfound hope, I've realized that I can persevere through the highs and those very low lows with the goal of steadily making a difference. I know that we're going to need to be very nimble as we figure out how to navigate all this. In fact, 2025 is already different than what we had originally planned because we've had to pivot. And as I look to the future, one thing has become really obvious, and that is that in the same way that the people rushed into Western North Carolina after the storm to help the people, we need a similarly huge response to address the cause of this disaster, climate change. It's going to take a lot more than just the scientists to make enough of a difference. We're going to need everyone that we can get. So I want to ask all of you to consider in your daily life choices how what you do intersects with the natural world. What we humans rely on the earth for everything, for our food and water and shelter and so much more. And it's time that we start to consider ourselves a part of the ecosystem and not just take, but also give. Giving can look different for everyone. That could mean volunteering. That could mean finding ways to use fewer resources and have a smaller ecological footprint. That could mean choosing a career path to help solve some of these problems. Because what you do affects animals like the hellbender and the bog turtle. So I want to ask you to let the desperation of this situation inspire you rather than discourage you. And if you feel disheartened by the news, just think of those people who have been through so much and yet they took the time to save that hellbender. What you do matters and makes a difference. I want to ask you to let hope motivate you to take action, as it has for me. Thank you.